Welcome to hashtag 52 Needs, and this week we're exploring leisure. And I'm so delighted to have with me David Fish, who is a globally recognized strategist, business leader, and record-breaking pilot. He works with leaders and business owners to help them set direction and unlock an inspiring ambition for their organizations and teams. David is also an experienced aviator who holds licenses to navigate anything that can fly except birds. And I think that includes small aircraft, commercial aircraft, helicopters. What else is there? Zeppelins.
Yep. Airships, balloons, skydiving. There's a whole
Yes.
range.
How many skydives have you done?
1,200.
I've had the privilege of been one of those acrobatic flights with you.
That's right.
And there's a picture of me where I look completely relaxed in the face, but I'm white knuckling it. I've got my arms up here, and it's like, yeah. Okay, we're talking leisure.
My form of leisure.
Yes, exactly. So, which takes us straight to the point. What is leisure for some people is not necessarily leisure for others. But we need leisure. So, what kind of leisure? I mean, let's look at the bandwidth of leisure. I mean, where does it start? Where does it end? Where is it so relaxing that you go into a coma, and where is it so stressful that you need to go into we need to be resuscitated?
That's a good question. I think at the heart of it for me, it's about escapism. Leisure it can be a distraction. So it can be that thing that just for a moment takes you away from what you're doing. So it can be a small period of time, or it can be a day, a week, a month, where you're just away from whether it's work or whether it's actually everything else in life. It's just, and that for me is all of the things I do in flying particularly give you that sense of escape. Because you have to put your attention, as you would know from the flight that we did when we flew aerobatics, but also 60 seconds of free fall is intense, but and so your mind is on one thing, which is what you're doing in that moment. And so that sort of I think the spectrum of leisure for me is about is that level of escapism, whether it's just a distraction in the moment, which could be reading a book for half an hour just to take you from one place to another. Right the way through, as I say, that sort of intensity spectrum that you described, where you literally can't be distracted because your life depends on it. And for some people, that's not relaxing, but it is escapism.
I remember I had a client once and I said, well, I hope you have a relaxing weekend. She says, absolutely. And I said, what are your plans? She says, I'm going free climbing. And I was like, that's not my idea of climbing, of leisure and relaxation. She said, no, I just love it. When I dangle, I've got all my attention and I'm hanging on, with the tips of my fingers of a rock. That's just the most relaxing thing because I'm completely present.
And I think that's it. I think it's that disconnection from distraction that can create that relaxation of the mind, as opposed to, I think when we say leisure, people think about kayaking or tennis or football in leisure pursuit sort of sense. Whereas for me, it's more about what you get from doing it versus what you do to get it.
Totally agree with you.
So that sort of, as I say, it can be as simple as a distraction, which could be picking up your phone to break one thought to get to another, or it can be as extreme as hanging off the side of a cliff. And I actually think when you watch people, I'm fascinated by people like Alex Honnold and his free climbing. And if you watch him prepare mentally for that, now he would call that leisure. He's totally in his zone. He's totally absorbed in what he's doing. He's 3,500 feet up the side of a sheer rock face without a rope. But he's in his zone. He's completely in that moment. And for him, that is purposeful leisure. Really interesting dynamic to watch him. Now, that for somebody else, that might be playing a game of pool with their favorite group of friends. But at that in that moment on that pool table, in that bar with those friends, they are not thinking about anything else.
Yes, I mean, I was thinking about that because, again, there are people who say, there's this judgment around leisure is not such a good thing. And I think leisure is absolutely crucial. Because again, as you said, you're focusing on something completely different. And if we keep doing the same thing over and over again, and we keep doing, working or, whatever it might be, and we do this consistently, the brain needs to have a break every now and then.
100%. And that's where connections are formed. That's where the brain surfaces information that's either buried deep in memory or buried just beneath the surface. You know, that those breakthrough moments that people have in the shower or on holiday or reading a book, it's not because they've got a breakthrough moment, it's because the brain's been allowed to join two pieces of information and form a connection that otherwise wouldn't have been there if you've just stayed in the one thought process trying to find the answer. The answer comes when you fuse two different bits of information, or you create a distraction from the thing you're trying to find, and you have that eureka moment. When you read two different books on your bookcase behind you and my bookcase behind me, when you jump from genre to genre, you find a connection, you find some magic in the stories, that, and it might be fiction or non-fiction, and suddenly two things connect that you'd never thought you could actually bring together. And I think that's what leisure does. It's that moment of breaking a thought process through either a distraction or a considered escape, if you like, from what you're doing, whether it's breaking the routine, whether it's just getting away from your desk, or whether it's deliberately going out and forcing yourself to do something, play a game of tennis, play a game of pool, climb a mountain, fly an airplane upside down, whatever it is that you get your sort of distractionary fix from. That's why I think it's important.
The funny thing is when I ask people and they say, oh, but I'm working all the time, because there's this whole blurring between, you know, we don't have work-life balance anymore. I actually prefer the work-life integration, but we do have an average of 5 hours of leisure time in the Western world. Even if we're working all the time, there's 5 hours. And I talk to people and they say, I don't know what to do. And there's weekends. And I go, and I said, so what are your plans? You know, like they take a few days off. And I said, oh yeah, I'm going to have some time off. And, well, what are you doing? I'm repairing the house. I'm cleaning the house. I'm going to organize my paperwork. I'm going to do all of that. That's not leisure. That's not work. You want to have something that completely changes. It takes you into a completely different context. I always joke, Newton would have never, ever discovered the laws of physics if he hadn't sat under a tree and went, no, I'm just going to relax here, and noticed that an apple fell on his head.
Yeah, I think I saw a quote the other day. It's sort of, and I think it applies to leisure in this context. It's do something for no other reason than you enjoy doing it. And that's the purpose of doing it is not to accomplish something. It's to not accomplish something. It's to do something that you just enjoy doing.
Exactly.
That's its purpose, as opposed to I'm doing this to gain something, an advantage, knowledge. You know, you can read a book to enjoy reading the book, or you can read a book because it advances your career.
Yeah.
One's got a work attachment to it. It's a conditional involvement that puts pressure on that, versus I'm going to read a chapter just because I fancy reading a chapter. I'm enjoying this book, and that allows me just to switch from that thought process to this thought process.
Oh yeah, I know that when I'm really, you know, when I need to, what you call escapism, when I need to escape, I love watching Netflix, but there's only so much of that I can take. I love reading. And I know that when I get into a space where I really don't, I need to escape and I need a reality check, or not check, a break, I read fantasy and sci-fi.
Yep.
Because that is just so far removed from my everyday world. I don't want to read about emotional intelligence or leadership or anything like that, because that's just, as you said, that's just work. But we get into this place of where even leisure has to be productive. You know, like, and it depends on, I mean, I'm not saying that for somebody, a book about emotional intelligence is not leisure. Absolutely not. Like for me, cooking is leisure. Somebody who cooks 3 times a day probably wouldn't say that. 100%. But this week, I mean, Saturday morning, I came back from the markets and I cooked 5 different dishes. You know, listened to some music, watched a little bit of Netflix, played with the dog, and, you know, and just cooked. And it was brilliant. But if I had to do it every day, probably not so much.
So I like, and I think it relates to this. So that I have this thought around when we talk about work-life balance, we used to think about it in the traditional sense of a seesaw, and one going up, one going down, which immediately puts the two things at odds, which creates a tension, which I don't think is healthy. I like to think of it in 3 dimensions. The one is you need to do things that earn money, because we all need some form of income. Then you need to do things that serve other people. And that can come in different forms. So in your cooking example, if you're cooking to serve other people, it doesn't have the same escapism as it does if you're cooking for yourself. And that's the 3rd dimension, is you need
Sorry, I disagree. Actually, I do. My neighbors love it when I cook because I go around and I say, I made this, would you like some?
Yeah.
But if they don't, that's okay. I'll just freeze it and eat it.
Yeah. But it's when you're doing something for yourself that there's no condition on it. There's no pressure. So when you're reading for work, you're reading because you're doing that either to earn money or to support somebody else by sharing your knowledge to help them. So there's pressure on you to take that content on board. If you're reading sci-fi just because you like to read sci-fi, there's no pressure on that.
No.
You're doing it for yourself. You're doing it without any expectation on yourself, any outcome or productivity. You're just going, I just enjoy this.
Yeah.
Just enjoy playing Snooker.
Agreed. My neighbors don't expect me. I don't promise them that I'm going to cook something for them. I'm not going to say, tomorrow I'm going to cook you 3 meals. I'm going to go, I've cooked something. Would you like it?
As opposed to, as you say, a parent who has to cook 3 meals for they have to do breakfast for the children, they have to prepare lunch for the children, and then the children expect dinner when they get home. Well, they're doing that for somebody else because that's expected. That puts pressure on the cooking versus, I'm just going to make a cake this weekend because I fancy making a cake. And if someone enjoys it, that's great. And if not, I'll eat it.
Exactly. Totally. My sense is, and I don't know what your opinion is about that people who are constantly under pressure to have productive leisure, like constantly doing something that fulfills a purpose for either other people or, like maintenance or whatever it might be. I think that if you don't allow yourself to have moments where you don't do anything and you get out of that Puritan mindset of constantly having to do things, which is, I grew up with that, like not doing anything meant I was lazy.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, there was, the only reason I was able to read was because my parents felt that was educational. They didn't realize what I was reading.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of resentment that people build up when they don't get leisure time.
Yeah.
When people go on holidays and they say, and especially now, like you're going on holidays.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's because we build expectation into everything we do. The photo that we take to post on Facebook, are we doing that because we just had a great experience? Are we doing that because we're trying to receive some likes and attention on where we've been or what we've done? So I agree. I think that's where I think understanding the motivation behind what you're doing. If you're laying on the sunbed just because you want to lay on the sunbed, that's leisure. That's good. That's the disconnect. That's the recharge. That's doing things that put energy back in the batteries as opposed to doing things that always take energy out of the batteries. And the minute, and again, in that reading context, when you're reading to absorb information, to create something, you're using energy as opposed to reading for pure enjoyment.
Yeah.
Taking notes, not marking books. And when I read a workbook, I just read 16 different strategy and research books for a piece of work. And I've got probably 70 bookmarks throughout that content to summarize. That's not switching off. No. I'm very engaged, very on, and very much using the batteries. So then I can still read, but I've got a book that's written by a pilot who flies around the world, and he's written about what it's like to be in the cockpit of an aeroplane going from city to city to city. I'm not taking notes. I'm just enjoying his view of what flying means to him and how he sees the world through a cockpit window. They're both the same experiences, but with very different results and outcomes.
Yeah, totally agree with you. Now, let me just open something else up, because a lot of people think that watching TV is leisure. And yes, it is. But is there a difference between doing leisure to relax, or is there a difference between, or is there also leisure to numb yourself, to escape from the burdens of life? And, again, escapism, I'm all in favor of escapism, but not as an addiction, as in, I need to have this in order to get away from work. Whereas I sometimes feel people use TV or playing games or gambling or anything like that, not as leisure, but it's almost like medicating the stress of work. Yeah,
I guess, is it avoidance as opposed to engagement? If you're reading a book, you're engaged in the content. You could argue there's two forms of social media. There's social media where you're engaged in what people are saying, you're reading a community group, you're following someone's journey, versus scrolling at 3 kilometers an hour through feeds, looking at pictures. One is you're probably avoiding something. And that might even be avoiding boredom. Boredom's again where the brain gets active. So if we're just trying to avoid boredom by operating our thumbs on a screen or pressing a remote control to change the channel, the engagement's missing.
Mm-hmm.
For me, that the leisure pursuits that allows you to disconnect and recharge is where you're doing something. So hitting a ball across the net, having a conversation with people who you enjoy having conversation with,
Yes.
Reading a book that stimulates the mind without an outcome, going and pursuing aviation and flying, but not actually going anywhere. Most of our flying, we take off in a private context, we take off and land at the same airport.
Yeah.
Airplanes were built to go places, and yet we take off, we fly around and we go back down because it's fun, because it's an enjoyable experience, because that's the no purpose to let's just go and explore a pursuit and be absorbed by that. So yeah, I think there is a difference. Maybe it's the engagement in the task that separates. When you can watch a documentary and you're engaged in the content, you're and again, you might not be doing it to learn, you're just engaged. Now watching Planet Earth with David Attenborough can be quite different to watching something sort of mindless sitcom, let's call it.
Yes. I was just, the other thought I just had when we were talking is children in front of iPads. Mm-hmm. It's almost like this takes us into, we're so busy. If somebody says to me, and I know I say it sometimes too, I'm busy. I've changed it actually now. I'm productively busy or I'm full on, unproductively full on. Mm-hmm. But parents, especially, and I don't have children, so I can only speak from what I'm observing around me. But parents, again, there's just so much to do. And I always think it's such a joke. We've got more equipment, more machinery, more support. Like my grandmother used to do laundry with my mother and me when I was tiny. It would take us a whole day to do the laundry for the family. Now I put the laundry in and I can still do a productive day. Go in and go, oh, I forgot to put it into the dry, But children also have to be in that busy state all the time. There's nothing worse than what I understand is when a child says, I'm bored. Parents almost panic. And I go, but boredom is good. It means that they can go and find something to interest them. But if we teach them that leisure is an outside in kind of thing and not an inside out.
I think it then goes into, it's interesting. So we've got all this stuff in our world, which is a lot of it creates distraction, consumes time. So if you actually want to create time for leisure, the 5 hours that we will have, then you have to get rid of some of the distractions that have now crept in, which is picking up your phone, which is, you've got a choice of LinkedIn, Snapchat, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook. There's a couple of hours that can be distraction time or could be leisure time. And I think it's the same with kids. A lot of the things that we do to distract them are electronic. And if that distraction wasn't there, you do what kids do, which is grab some chalk and draw on the walls, or go and dig a hole in the garden, or turn that box into a rocket, which is the imagination at play. That there was a great ad from Samsung a few years ago when they bought the TV home at Christmas, and they unwrapped this massive plasma TV as it was then, and then the kids start playing with the box. And that's the beauty of the imagination, particularly in children, the creativity, that if you don't distract them and boredom creeps in, boredom creates that brain cycle of getting imaginative, and that's when play comes into play, as opposed to just create the distraction.
Exactly. So we need to really differentiate between purpose, and I'm not saying productive and as in constantly doing things leisure, but leisure that has a purpose of recharging, of, no, it's not brain breaking, but interrupting brain patterns. So that we can get into a space of resetting.
I'd say brain switching between even a work task and a non-work task, or a task with a task with an expectation versus a task without one. You can recharge when you're doing something, but it doesn't have an expectation or an outcome attached to it. Versus, and that's the reading example, reading is reading, but reading a book for leisure is different to reading a book for work.
Yeah.
And one has a deadline, and I have to find the right content, and I have to better summarize it, and I've got to which page was it on again? How does that link? Can I go and read that chapter? That's using energy, as opposed to, for you, reading science fiction, which is giving you energy back. So I think it's that brain switching, and then the motivation behind what you're doing, and the ability to skip boredom to creativity. Embrace boredom to get into an activity that you're absolved into with no particular outcome.
I'd say that was the perfect summary.
Who knew we would get there?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. This was leisure in life. We're going to continue in another little video with leisure at work. Thanks, Fishy. Really appreciate your wisdom and insight. And thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you next week.